Hello everybody, welcome to my Module 9 discussion. This is about Chapter 13. It is the dark side of organizational communication. It is all about counterproductive behaviors in the workplace that lead to dysfunction, unhappiness, quitting. So let's start with discussing the key components of the propositions regarding employee abusive organizations, EAO. And in the book on page 388, there's Lutgen and Sandvik and McDermott who mentioned that much of the aggression that takes place in an organization is not just the individual. It's not due to one bad apple. Organizational abuse takes form in the structure of the whole organization. And it's a systematic process created and perpetuated by various parts of that system, whether it's from the top, from the bottom, from outside. And so this is talking about theoretical propositions that explain the link between these concepts. So there are 7 of these propositions, and just a quick summary. Number 1 is abusive discourse across multiple message flows. And that's not just, again, if there's one bad apple and they're acting up in bad ways, it's really not employee an EAO situation. But if you have multiple channels, like if you've got parallel bad things from the top down, from the bottom up, these are multiple message flows that reinforce the type of climate that's going on. Number 2 is leadership condones abusive discourse. That means when they do it, they're setting the example and they give the green light for the rest of the organization to do it. Number 3, multiple members breach the norm of civil discourse. There may be an established framework, rule, norm, and there are individuals that kind of push the boundaries or act out. So you've got to catch this and control it early on. 4 is organizational structure characterized by competition, individualism, and aggression. Just by the nature of the job that you're doing, the type of people that are in it, they tend to be more confrontational, aggressive, out for themselves, stabbing each other, competitive. And number 5 is things worsen as they persist. So as they go on unchecked, they'll just continue to get worse. 6, it harms the wider range of stakeholders, such as investors and customers, people who are not directly in the team but outside, and they're affected by it. And number 7, it can be corrected, but it takes a long and concerted effort. Leaders are crucial then to the setting of the climate and the culture through their own example and pointing out and correcting others. This reminds me of a fictitious workplace, especially there's a movie or a play called Glengarry Glen Ross, where it's harsh. I mean, you feel pretty abused yourself watching that movie, but there's abuse from all directions. There's leadership, who's the most aggressive and belittling. Alec Baldwin has a famous speech where he comes in and he is going to whip this team into shape. There's a guy who's an underperformer in the back who's kind of not interested. He's really not. He doesn't like to take input, but he's in the back getting some coffee for himself. And Alec Baldwin's character says, "Put that coffee down. Coffee is for closers." So implying that you're a loser. You don't get even the basic level of respect until you start pulling your own weight. So in a small team, they're all at each other's throats, figuratively, kind of literally at some point. Highly aggressive and competitive. So again, Alec Baldwin's famous speech: first prize is a Cadillac. Second place, a set of steak knives. Third place, you're fired. So the story takes place late in their history, it seems. And things have continued to go on corrosive for years. The actual clients feel traumatized after encountering these salesmen. And there's no indication of hope for correcting this environment other than everyone going to prison, which kind of how it turns out. Fortunately, I don't have a lot of experience with this problem, though I do recognize the propositions. I once had a boss who was not kind to me at all, who made me feel terrible, belittled me, terrorized me. And I was glad when I quit, and gratified a couple of years later when I saw the news that boss had come into some significant professional ethical charges. So my direct team now is great, thanks to my manager, but a parallel team that I'm working with is not doing so great. The manager seems to promote aggressiveness, and I see a lot of counterproductive things going on. So I'm glad I didn't get hired onto that team. So next, differentiate between the labyrinth and the glass ceiling. As part of the model of organizational discrimination from figure 13.3, the term glass ceiling is brought up. And if an organization claims to be inclusive and non-discriminatory, they really need to stop and look at their organizational chart to see the characteristics of who is in those positions. It's mostly middle-aged white males at the top. It's not an official policy or a reasonably valid assertion that women don't belong above a certain level in the org chart, but it's a clear tendency in the behavior. So there may be an actual rule that says we promote diversity, non-discrimination, but the actual behavior is different than that. It's as though there's an invisible but unbreachable barrier where women and minorities are held back. Those who are not in the in group, they're the out group individuals. One might argue, as the devil's advocate, I'll do that favor for you, that women have intrinsic characteristics that are naturally limiting their abilities in top leadership positions. You would say things like they have a tendency to prioritize their family commitments over their careers. They have a tendency to be less aggressive. They have the tendency to be domineering, to physically assert themselves. But it's a futile generalization. We are all human beings. We all have the same capabilities. Some of us may have different capabilities, but as a whole, humans should be regarded in the same way. There might be occasionally limited incidences where women and minorities actually reach these top positions. But it's almost like we get someone to that position and then kind of it never happens again. Whether a certain person becomes president, minority or female, if someone gets to be, in top management or whatever, it happens so rarely that it's practically tokenism happening. That means we did it just that once to say, see, we got it. And then you just never have to worry about it again. Eagley and Carley from page 393 suggest that it may not be a single point where disadvantageous outgroup individuals get trapped. They just don't have a straight path to success. There is a point where, it's not easy to just go to that next step. They have to find their way in what they call a labyrinth, like a maze. They might go a few steps forward, but the path is blocked, so they have to find some left or right, backwards, going around until they get to where they need to. They face multiple challenges, have to traverse an unusual career path, and they have to prove themselves repeatedly beyond what others might have to do. They really have to compensate for the position they're in. They can get promoted to manager, but then they can't progress to director. Instead, all they can do is move laterally. That's like their lot, is they end up having to go through a maze. And it seems to me that there are many more examples of women and minorities in many meaningful positions of authority now. But the proportion of middle-aged white males is still very imbalanced. An example I think of for the glass ceiling is if we could have sent women to the moon 50 years ago instead of just men. I mean, look at the makeup of the individuals that went up. They're all, they match the profile of aggressive, daring, outgoing men who had a lot of experience in the military as fighter pilots. So we clearly understand women are well suited to the challenges of space flight. You can do your own research on that, if you doubt it, but there is plenty of evidence that women do just as well in that role. I think it was, I'm going to have to do research on myself, but I think the Soviet Union sent a woman up into space a lot earlier than we did. No difference from men. But in the late 60s, women were unable to get the training and experience. So there was actually a barrier. Like maybe they were capable of doing it, but they were not enabled. They were not empowered to get the training they needed. They could not be combat fighter pilots in any capacity. They could not get any experience doing that. These days, we have women as combat pilots and as equal crew members and commanders in the International Space Station, for example. Okay, next, what is the relationship between organizational justice and retaliatory behavior? There was kind of an unscientific study in the late 1940s asking former American soldiers returning from World War II about whether they had gotten a, quote, a square deal from the Army. Those of you who are not native speakers, that just means it was fair, it was just. So the researchers drew a correlation between fair promotion rates and criticism. That means those individuals who got promoted on it seemed like a fair timeline with their peers, people who went through the same route of training or were in the same groups, units together, were in the same amount of time, got promoted at the same rate. There are some cases where some got promoted slower and faster, and so there was a perceived injustice going on. So I can relate to this with my own. I had a similar experience. I was in the U.S. Army, enlisted for 5 years, and never got promoted except for when I started. As kind of a starting bonus, they promoted me to E4 to start off with, E4 specialist, because I was a college graduate. They just said, okay, automatically check this box, you get to be an E4. But once I got in, there were basically no promotions in my job to get promoted. The way the Army does it is based on the specific jobs. They have a number of promotion slots that are available. And so my job was just limited. No one, I mean, even the top performers from my perspective were getting promoted. And so time passed, and after 3 years, I just realized I'm never getting promoted, and I feel kind of pointless. And I got kind of sorry for myself and kind of not enthused about it anymore. And I just decided along the way that this is not for me. I'm really not interested in pursuing this. And to make matters worse, I was in a group that had multiple jobs. You know, my job was a specific one that was not getting promoted, but there were a couple of others that were like really on the fast track. They were really hot. They were really, anyone that came in was getting promoted on a fast track. As an example, there was a guy who became an E5, became my supervisor, my superior, and he had only been in for about 2.5 years, I think, from E1 to E5. And that blew my mind. Like, how is that even fair and possible? And I really got sour to the whole situation at that point. So it's not the primary reason why I left the Army, but it did not help me feel devoted. So talking now about organizational justice or injustice is discussed during, starting on page 404 with the ideas from Homans in 1958. He brought up the idea of social exchange theory. We have many actions we can choose to take. Each action has a cost and reward associated with it. We are inherently self-oriented, trying to get the best cost reward for ourselves. So they use the term hedonistic. And hedonistic means whatever gives the most like happiness or joy or pleasure to the most people. And so that's based on the idea that we're individualists looking out for ourselves. So we make actions that we calculate will give us the best cost versus reward, the best results. We try to maximize our profits. So those rewards being rewards, meaning the wages we make, the status we get, the acknowledgement, promotions, minus the costs. That would be actual money we put in as expenses, time, risks or dangers that we face. And so the profits are, it's the outcome of the work we put in and the costs that come off of it. So we can feel injustice if we perceive that others get better rewards and costs than us in the same circumstances. It's interesting that a crucial piece of information to keep secret at your workplace, at most workplaces, is what is everyone's salary. That is like one of the most tightly guarded secrets, because if people find out, it's going to cause trouble. We can rapidly become resentful when we feel and we find out who's getting paid more despite perceptions that they're not more valuable in their role. So in one job I had, I learned after the fact that someone on the team, they were in a different job. You know, I didn't really work with them that much, but they were not my superior. So they had been making double my salary. And I felt a little bit like dirt. Like, you know, I felt I was working pretty hard. I was a manager and all this stuff. But this other guy who was more of like a programmer, even though that's a more technical skill, he didn't have any responsibility. He didn't, you know, didn't do the same sort of things. I perceived that I had a greater cost to my job, but he was getting paid twice as much. So after the fact, I got pretty bummed. So also interesting is that most public sector positions, such as in the Army, the pay grades are openly posted. It's no secret what each person is earning. So you can go on any government website and find out what every rank in every place in the world is making. You could calculate, what their paycheck is. Or for government officials, GS, there are different levels. You can see really clearly. You can know what your boss makes, what your people on your team make. And with that kind of open knowledge, I don't think it adversely affects anyone. I don't think anyone is resentful, but it's also your boss can't make a special deal with you, which you do in the private sector. In the private sector, it's a free market. You can offer, secretly to pay anyone what you negotiate, what you feel they're worth. And so situations like that could happen. You could have two people that are exactly the same role, exactly the same qualifications, but in order to entice a person, that you like, then you could offer them more. Or, you could have gotten the bad end of the stick, like you were not as assertive and bold, and asking for what you wanted. And when you were negotiating your salary, you just didn't ask for as much, and so you end up getting paid less for the same job. That's a challenge. Okay. So further breaking down the theory of justice, in quotes, distributive justice relates to the perceived exchange relationship that employees have with their employers. This exchange relationship, it could be explained that when we go into a position of employment with an employer, we are expecting to have an arrangement where we put on our work, the costs, and our reward is the money we make, and we expect that profit is going to be in a positive, result. So again, where the profit equals the reward, the pay, perks, and status minus the cost of work, danger, and toil. If a worker thinks that others in the same realm are getting better rewards, or they're incurring lower costs, lower risk, lower time, they will feel cheated. Procedural justice comes from research. This is from Thibaud and Walker 405 on legal dispute resolution. An individual's belief that procedures are fair and consistent. Suppressed bias. They're accurate, correctable, representative, ethical. Interactional justice from Bies and Moog from 405 identified the components as truthful, justified, respectful, and appropriate. With all these perceptions of injustice, it can be difficult to maintain trust and devotion. Both the leaders and the followers need to be metacognitive about their perceptions. I mean, you can have your regular reaction to things, but you need to step back and think about the way you're thinking about things. If you see something happen and you start to feel it's unfair, step back a little bit and say, okay, why is it unfair? Is this real? Is there something I need to change about my attitude, or I need to bring up with my boss or the employee? Give the benefit of the doubt, communicate about those perceptions, and strive to keep your integrity up. The downside is that trust, communication, and effectiveness deteriorate once these perceptions run loose. So that's why metacognition is important, because you need to keep those perceptions in check. Sorry, running long. We're going to try to get through this. Okay, so now talking about retaliatory behavior as described on page 407. It's when you want to make the wrongdoer pay, get even with someone, as you've labeled them as a transgressor. You feel like they've acted out, they've violated the rules. And this is not always negative entirely, such as calling out someone for cheating or filing a lawsuit against a company that is threatening its surroundings with waste, toxic chemicals. However, it can also be negative when an individual is isolated, shunned, and alienated in the organization. They're extensively shut out. They're pushed into the out-group. Can also take a negative course when an individual feels wronged by the organization or other employees, and the individual feels a need to restore the balance, take matters in their own hands. And they may steal or defraud the company, slack off, or just cause other damage. All right, so final question in conclusion. Identify what you believe to be the most important topic in chapter 13. I would like to share with you, this chapter is particularly insightful and relevant to me. It describes many ways that human nature can go off the rails and break down the trust and effectiveness in a workplace environment. I am sure that I want to take a closer look at the chapter again down the road, but the topic that seems to me to be the most important to internalize is the EAO, Employee Abusive Organization. It's a big negative factor that can come in from any direction, whether that's from outside, from the lower level workers, or from the top leadership. And I need to recognize that when I'm promoting or condoning this meanness, as well as what's coming from above, I need to be aware and make a decision, just take a stand. Okay, yet again, I am really ashamed, but I have a good example of this abusive behavior. When I was a team leader, I've told you about this organization before, a lot of things going on were wrong, looking back. I remember that someone was hired and put on my team that I didn't like. As a matter of fact, since I'm the guy that did the hiring and actual, background checks and made the hiring decisions up to a point, I still had to hand that off to, the owner who would approve or reject. And there was a situation where another manager in the company had a son who was just, looking for a job. He was in college, looking for something to do. And I kind of had met him before. He's kind of a nerdy, I don't know how to describe it. He was, let's just put it in these terms. He was not a strong, he did not have strong character. He was not well-spoken. He was definitely not technically proficient. All these factors that I considered him to be a non-starter in this position. But I still interviewed, and a couple of minutes into the interview, I just gave up because this kid is, sorry, that was rude. This individual was really not, even for our low standards, I didn't consider him to be a really good candidate for this position. And so I just stopped the interview 2 minutes in and turned it into just a conversation, just to be nice. Talked for about 20 minutes and that was it. So I went over to my supervisor and said, look, are you kidding? This guy is really not going to work out. I really don't want to hire him. Can we just, pass on him? But nope. Despite my vote not to hire, the owner pushed ahead, hired him, said, here you go, get started, train him up. And I realized I may have been acting out at that point in retaliation since the other better hires I wanted before had been rejected. Not fair. So I started to give this young man pressure, pushed his buttons. This was tough love, but without the love. A lot less experience, so it was easy to stress him out. And honestly, at the time, I hoped that he would either crack and quit or maybe become tougher, become more effective, but it was going to be a painful process for all of us. So I'm convinced that I was abusive because I was trying to make him feel bad. I was singling him out, like I said, pushing his buttons. During one of our performance review sessions, I made him cry. Good job. Okay, but to be fair, I did have multiple performance reviews and set specific objectives with him. And after I left the company, I hear that he was doing pretty well. He got promoted to level 2, despite or thanks to my influence. Don't know. So I know how terrible that sounds, and I have to question whether it was justified. Probably not. But I promise I won't make any of you break down and cry or want to quit while you're working with me. Thank you very much. Take care.